The girl in the front row. After my first 3 years of liceo were up, I left Trapani. My sister Enza had married an officer in Lapudesa's Coast Guard, and her husband had been transferred to Syracuse. I joined a school there and went to live with them. Finally, to my relief, I was no longer alone. When I got home from school, Enza would already have the lunch ready. I loved being able to sit at her family table. But in Syracuse, too, I continued to pine for the sea. After lunch, I would find myself taking the long walk down to the harbor. I would spend hours on the docks and watching the seagulls, looking at the boats, and thinking of Lampudesa. It became something of a ritual. Even when it was raining or cold, or if I was running a temperature, I simply had to be there. Pietro, you'll catch your death, and what will I say? What will I say to Mama? My sister said every now and then, but she understood my compulsion to spend time by the water. Deep down, she too missed Lampudesa. She knew that I needed salty air in my lungs. It was a visceral attraction we had both inherited. I loved going down to the harbor even when there was a storm. The sound of waves battering the harbor walls was invigorating to me. When I'd had my fill of the sea breeze, I would go home and study until late at night, counting the days until the summer holidays. Since I was a good student, my teacher let me go home a month before the end of each school year and return a few weeks late for the next. At 14, like all my friends, I took the necessary swimming and rowing tests to obtain a seaman's book that would allow me to board fishing vessels. I passed at the first attempt, as most Lampudesan boys do, and from that point on, I spent my summers out at sea with my father. No sooner had I got off the ferry in Lampudesa than I boarded his fishing boat. We had fished for 4 months straight, and often through the night I was an assistant to the engineer and was in charge of looking after the dinghy. I received the same pay as a grown man. The profits were divided into parts, and each member of the crew received one or more depending on the nature of their job. As a matter of course, I gave my father every lira I earned. Sending me to school was expensive, and I had to give him something back. For the first few years, I was terribly seasick and was forever looking for a quiet corner of the fishing boat so that no one would see me heaving over the edge. I was ashamed and didn't want my father to think I was too weak and faint-hearted for the job. But one day I confessed to my mother. She bought 30 rusty nails and red wine, a concoction that was thought to give one a strong stomach, although all it did in truth was make me very drunk. Then I was taken to an old woman of the island, a witch of sorts. She prayed over me and looked me up and down, measured my head, shoulders, and pelvis. Sometime later, I finally started doing better. I was never embarrassed by seasickness again. In Syracuse, I was placed in a coeducational class for the first time. Since I was fairly short, I was assigned to sit in the front row next to a very pretty girl named Rita. I asked her out straight away. She rejected my advances and found my persistence irritating. Eventually, though, she gave in. She said it was because I made her laugh. Rita came from a tiny castle town in the mountains called Furla, or Afera in dialect. One cold and snowy winter Sunday afternoon, I borrowed a motorcycle and made my way along what seemed an endless string of improbably winding roads until I finally reached Furla. My friends had given me directions to Rita's house. I glimpsed her through the window. She was practicing her embroidery, looking prettier than ever, but the moment she saw me, she vanished. I took a deep breath and knocked. Rita's mother opened the door. I did not know what to say, but I was already standing there, and it was too late to turn around and leave. Nor could I miss this chance, so I introduced myself, explained that I loved her daughter, and asked for her permission to propose to her. Rita's mother invited me inside, whereupon I encountered one of Rita's aunts. The aunt threw me a fantastically suspicious squint, took Rita's mother aside and said, Chistu e chido de Lampudesa, Rita su tutti selvaggi. Is this the boy from Lampudesa? Be careful, they're all savages out there. To Rita's family, I might as well have been from another planet. Lampudesa was not Italy, and it certainly wasn't Sicily. In effect, it was Africa. But they did not remain wary of me for long. Soon they began treating me like their own son, and Rita became my life partner, the mother of my 3 children, Grazia, Rosanna, and Giacomo. She is the woman who shares my joy when I come home after helping a woman give birth or successfully treating a child. The woman who eases my pain whenever I have to face the deaths of innocent people, which these days occurs more and more often. After finishing school, Rita and I moved to Catania to study medicine. We both wanted to do well, especially since our parents were paying our tuition fees. We worked away together in a little flat we rented from the university, passed all our exams, and graduated on the same day. I shall never forget the look of my mother and father's eyes when my name was announced. Their son was a doctor. They could hold their heads high. With the little they earned by fishing day and night, they had raised 7 children and put one of them through university. Their one bet had paid off. Risky investments. When refugees arrive on Lampedusa, the rescue team and the medical staff are the first people they meet. As such, we are also the first people to whom journalists come for stories about the crisis. Anxious as I am to raise awareness of the issue, I have over time become something of a spokesperson to the media, giving interviews for newspapers, magazines, and radio and television programs in as many countries as I can. During one interview for an Italian newspaper, a journalist and I were speaking about the children and teenagers who arrive on the island without their parents after fleeing their countries alone. Every time I meet young people like this at the pier, I think about how their families have staked everything on them. The journalist told me that before the crisis exploded in the Mediterranean, she spent time in a remote village on another shore, collecting stories from such families. They were living in shanties and waiting days, weeks, even months at a time for news of their kin. Many had nothing to remember their children by but photographs neatly pinned on mud walls, smiling faces of children who may have crossed the sea, only to be laid in coffins on the other side. Young women who had been left alone with newborn babies shed tears on these photographs. Mothers who had watched their little ones steal away to Europe were grieving over them. There are phantom villages in which only the elderly, the woman, and the youngest boys remain, as if after a war, but in this case the culprit is not war, but a grinding poverty that makes it impossible for parents to feed their families. Hearing people pontificate on television talk shows about the difference between economic migrants and refugees infuriates me. It makes me wonder if all my work has been in vain. In those villages, there are also people who can tell you proudly of children who left and managed to make a brighter future for themselves. Some of them returned to repay the investment their families made, sharing the gains from that winning bet. We see many young people like that in Lampedusa. I examine them at the pier, visit them at the reception center, stumble upon them when I am out and about. When they leave the center to go for a walk, they are always considerate and careful not to cause a nuisance. Especially at the beach, they keep a distance from tourists as if they are afraid of bothering them. One day in June, I saw a group of them at Guitia, a pristine beach just out of town that is a favorite of families with children. The young refugees had clustered on a rock away from the holiday makers. I was amazed that they did not hate the sea for what it had done to them. holding them at its mercy for so many ghastly days and nights, swallowing up their friends, separating them from their countries. Then, of course, I remembered that this was also the sea that had given them hope, saving them from certain death by war or famine. A skinny boy who looked older than the others was standing a little further off. He was watching mothers play with their children on the beach, and he was weeping. I went to him and asked if he was all right. He said that he was 19 and come from Ghana. "I miss my mother," he sobbed. "I was happy to leave Ghana. I planned the route with my friends. Everyone told us how amazing Europe was. They said we would find jobs here and make lots of money. Then one day we would go home and give our families a better life. But now we have been through hell. The journey was horrible, and I have no idea what to do or where to go. What's going to happen when they take us away and send us somewhere else? Where will we end up? I'm so scared." He sounded miserable. "You're the doctor who was on the pier, aren't you?" "Yes," I said, though I did not remember examining him. I have seen so many people that I cannot remember all of their faces. "So you must be an important person. Why do you ask?" "Because if you are an important person, maybe you can help me. I want to go back to my mother and my family. Please, can you help?" He was speaking through tears. I didn't know what to say to him. No one had ever asked me to help them get home before. I told him that I had no power to arrange for him to go back to Ghana. I was just a doctor, not an important person. I asked him what his name was, and he promised to talk to someone who was actually responsible for things like that. He understood what I was saying, but he was inconsolable. He'd been hoping I could help him. I felt terrible, too, powerless in the face of such a request. I tried to calm him down and tell him that things would get better soon, but he did not believe me. When I left him, he was still crying. Some young migrants allow themselves to show weakness. Others refuse to surrender, even in the face of unthinkable hardship. One day, a motorboat full of people arrived at the pier. After letting them disembark, I boarded the boat together with a few other workers, because there was a boy on board who had lost the use of his legs. We wondered what had caused his disability and how he could possibly have made it this far. We lifted him off the boat, and we were preparing to transfer him to a wheelchair when we were interrupted by a yell, "Stop, stop!" It was a teenager who had broken away from the refugees. He was gesticulating at us and shouting in English, "Leave him alone." He came over to us, lifted his companion onto a back in a single swift motion, and returned to his place in line with the others. Astounded, I looked at the other workers and asked the interpreter to speak to him. This was their story. They were brothers, and they had left Somalia together. Muhammad, the older of the two, had been injured in a gunfight back home that left him paralyzed. Nevertheless, he had decided to attempt the journey to Italy together with Hassan, his younger brother. Hassan had carried Muhammad the entire way. Together, they had crossed the desert, arrived in Libya, and finally boarded a boat. The smugglers had mocked them relentlessly and could have killed Hassan for his obstinate refusal to abandon his disabled brother. But Hassan had not left Muhammad, even for a moment, and he did not want to be separated from him. Now that they were both finally safe, the two practically lived in symbiosis. Hassan was exhausted, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he reassured Muhammad, whose head was resting on his shoulder. Several days later, I saw them waiting for the boat that would take them from Lampedusa to their next destination. Muhammad was still on Hassan's back. Hassan saw me and made a gesture as to say, "See, doctor, we can take care of ourselves. We don't need anyone." I stopped and looked at them. Hassan was right. He and his brother were a single being, one body with two heads. I thought of Martin Luther King Jr.'s words, which, happily, this pair were on their way to disproving. "We've learned to fly the air like birds. We've learned to swim the seas like fish, Yet we haven't learned to walk the earth as brothers and sisters. By contrast, Muhammad and Hassan embodied all the love, dedication, and selflessness one could dream of between two brothers.